By now, I expect everyone's a little bit saturated with the crisis in the American presidency. I have the distinct impression that the news media are kind of rationing their stories because all they need is about one brand new breakthrough or leak every about 3 to 4 days to keep the temperature right where they seem to want it. And the thing stays hot all the time. I thought a week or so ago that they were exhausting it. I thought it was going to die. It was the story was cooling down, and I thought we're going to cruise on through this. And then whammo comes along another revelation. And I just wonder what else they've got on the back burner. I had the distinct impression with the speed with which ABC, NBC, and CBS were able to confirm the New York Times story this last week, my suspicion was that they also had the story, but that they had decided not to go with it yet. And then when the New York Times broke the story, well, they were able to confirm it right off the bat because they already knew about it. But anyhow, I think we are all getting surfeited with it and really a little tired of it. And I have no desire to add to that surfeit. But I think it might be well for us to pause and see if we can get a little perspective, and particularly a biblical perspective, on the situation. Have any of you noticed the parallels between what's happening with the presidency and what is happening with certain parts and nooks and crannies of the church? If you've been paying attention, or if you're aware of what's been going on in the church, the comparison is interesting, both in the Church of God International and in the United Church of God in California, who have also just fired their president out there. It's fascinating to me to watch this take place. Now, it may be purely coincidental, but I know a lot of you don't know this, that the big crisis that the Worldwide Church of God went through back in the early 70s ran right down the line parallel with the crisis with President Nixon and led up to the Nixon resignation. Those were running at the same time then, just like this crisis is running at the same time now. It's a little bit uncanny. I'm not prepared to say that it's any more than a coincidence, but and of course the scandal back then was a totally different kind of scandal, but nevertheless the spirit involved in it and the things surrounding it were all the same. The word cover-up was really strong. You remember during the Nixon crisis? That same word was big in the Worldwide Church of God in those years as they fought their way through their own version of the scandals that were taking place in the White House. Now, as I think about this and as I listen to the news programs, the thing that is being talked about a great deal now, the question is whether or not President Clinton was able, in 1992 and before that when he was elected, 1992, no, that's when he was first elected, and the later election, has he been able to make the disconnect between the private life and the public performance of the President of the United States? The idea is that the morals, the private morals of the President don't matter. What matters is the public performance. And I have to say that I'm getting the distinct impression that a lot of people in the country are buying that. That they are saying, yeah, I don't think it matters. What his public performance is what matters. His private morals are not significant to his public life. And when you have over half of the people in this country who surveyed believe that the President is lying about what the French call l'affaire La Monica. And at the same time, he has an approval rating as high as any president has ever had in history. I think it's a little higher than President Bush's was right after the Gulf War and the flush of all that took place at that particular time, where everything that he did have to do with the president and the way he actually carried out these things. Now, a great deal has been said about this separation of the private and public lives of our leaders. The question is, I sit there and I listen to this and I say, what's the matter with these people? Why is it that it's so clear to me that the private morals of the most powerful man in the world are important? How can people come to this kind of a conclusion in what they're saying? On Sunday morning, the President and the First Lady went to church. And as they left, the President had a Bible in his left hand. I believe the President's left-handed. And as he walked out from church, the crowds were out there, and he waved at the crowds with his left hand. So here he is looking almost like Jimmy Swaggart walking across the podium with the Bible in his hand as a preacher. The President of the United States comes out of church on Sunday morning, waves the Bible in his hand. A matter of a very few days after he has stood up and given to the nation what most people, I read several articles in the New Republic this last week, which is a liberal publication, very liberal publication. Every article in there assumed that the President had sexual affair with Monica Lewinsky. Every one of them assumed that. The President publicly and very loudly denies this. Now, what does it say about the president if he walks out of church waving a Bible in his hand, and then just a few days before that had told an absolute, unmitigated lie to the American people on public television, on television to everybody, national television? Does it make any kind of a statement at all about the man? For he could have, if he really believed that there was no disconnect, there was a disconnect between his private morals and his public service, he could have responded, "My private affairs are none of your business. Let's go on with the affairs of the nation." He didn't do that. He chose to emphatically deny it. Now, I'm not arriving at any conclusions myself. I'm not going to convict a man until, all the evidence is in. I'm just simply saying that most of his friends believe he's guilty, and therefore believe that he lied, and a man comes out of church waving a Bible at us. Well, I don't know. Even his friends, as I said, seem to think he lied, because they are saying that it is not important that he lied about a little sexual fling as long as he does a good job running the country. Now, mind you, they are not merely saying that the little sexual fling is irrelevant. They are now saying that if he lied about it, it's irrelevant. Now, you've got to think what that says about the person who is adopting that particular position. And there are a very large number of people in this country who feel precisely that way, as is revealed by the different polls that came along. Now, how is it, do you think, that we have come to the place where we think that cheating on your wife and lying is acceptable behavior? Well, I'm going to take you back to an Old Testament prophet, Isaiah chapter 29. And when I turn to the Old Testament prophets in this particular sermon, it's not going to be so much because they were writing to us, although I do believe they were writing to us and their message is directed at us. I'm going to bring it up because I think it reveals the hand of God in history. It tells us what He thinks. It tells us how He reacts. And we know that God doesn't change. So if He responded to people in a certain way back then, I think it's fair to say He's going to respond in a similar manner to us now in the 20th century. Isaiah 29 and verse 9. Stay yourselves and wonder. Cry you out and cry. They are drunken, but not with wine. They stagger, but not with strong drink. For the Lord has poured out upon you the spirit of deep sleep, and has closed your eyes. There comes a place in time where we have been so dishonest for so long, where we have dismissed God from public life for so long, that God will actually pour out upon us a spirit of deep sleep and will close our eyes to where we can no longer make sensible decisions. I don't have the 59th chapter of Isaiah in my sermon, but you might give it a study with a view to seeing the connection between lying and truth on the one hand and judgment on the other. That whenever a person begins to lie, when a person begins to shade the truth, when a person begins to play word games with you, their judgment goes in the tank at the same time. And if you just follow it logically through, you're going, I don't even have to think I have to explain to you how, that when you lose contact with the truth, your judgment is going to go bad. And you're going to start doing stupid things. And I think we are in the process of seeing a classic example of it in our society and in the church in recent months. He goes on to say after he said this, he said, I've closed your eyes, the prophets and your rulers, the seers, He has covered. Now, this is really kind of interesting. I don't think many people quite make this connection in biblical history. But in God's eyes, the prophets, the seers, and the priests are considered rulers of the people. They are the princes of the people. Sure, there is a king. But in God's eyes, the king was really the physical leader of the country. The spiritual leadership of the country. The spiritual leadership, here's a scripture to that effect, are in the prophets and the seers. And there's another one that calls the priests, the rulers of the people. The vision of all this has become unto you as the words of a book that is sealed, which man delivered to one that is learned and says, read this, I pray you. And he said, I can't, it's sealed. Now, what book? Well, you've got one right there in your hands. That's perfectly good. And you can hand it to a learned man. He said, I'm sorry, it's a mystery. I can't understand many of the things that I read in here. He said, we've come to the place where, because God has poured out on us a spirit of slumber, that we can open the Bible and it's still sealed. We don't understand it. We don't grasp it. We can't deal with it like we ought to be able to deal with it. He said, and then the book is delivered to him that is not learned, saying, read this, I pray you. And he says, I can't, I'm not learned. In other words, the whole thing is shut up to you. Now, the real danger in this, and this is something I want to warn you about, is this thing creeps up on you over time. And it's just as easy for you who think you know the Bible, who think you understand the Bible, to come to the place to where you open it up and you begin to perceive certain things that are not really in it. Because you have begun to stray away from that hardcore honesty that is required if you're going to have a relationship with God and with His Word. Whenever you start lying to yourself, when you start compromising with your own judgment, when you start compromising with God's standards in terms of morality, truth, all these things, the Bible is going to close up on you because you're not using it, because you're not applying it, and because you're not living by it. In years gone by, many of us were a part of an organization where it seemed at least like we did a fairly good job of living by the Bible. But the problem was, a great deal of that was external discipline. And the question in God's mind is, just how much of this is external discipline and how much of this obedience is coming from your heart? Well, He's been in the process now for some time of beginning to find that out. And I think it's time that each and every one of us also begin to give some attention to finding out about ourselves, as to whether or not we're prepared to be honest with the Scriptures or not, whether we're going to be obedient to God or not, or whether we're going to play games and pretend that we found some other answer when we really haven't found it or not. As we keep it up, it's entirely possible for those of us who've had our eyes open to have our eyes closed. He continues to tell them, the book is delivered to him that is not learned, and says, read this. And he says, I can't read it, I'm not learned. Wherefore the Lord says, for as much as this people draw near to me with their mouth, and with their lips they honor me, but have removed their heart far from me, and their fear toward me is taught by the precept of men. Not by the Bible. You've got all kinds of your traditions, your structures, your organization, and your fear of God is really a fear of the church rather than of God. This is going to happen. Therefore, behold, I will proceed to do a marvelous work among this people, a marvelous work and a wonder. For the wisdom of their wise men will perish. You're going to be the wisest old head in Washington, D.C., and that wisdom is going to go in the toilet. You can be a man in the church who is held in great honor for wisdom and understanding, and it can go in the tank because God takes that wisdom away from you. The understanding of the prudent men, it'll be hid. Woe unto them that seek deep to hide their counsel from the Lord, and their works are in the dark, and they say, well, nobody will see. Nobody will know. If you and I will just both deny it, nobody will ever be able to prove otherwise. Have you ever heard anything like that? Surely, he says, your turning of things upside down shall be esteemed as the potter's clay. Now, do you understand what he's saying here? Your turning of things upside down. All right. Assume a situation to where an investigator, say Kenneth Starr, has systematically been unloading and developing and putting together a lot of testimony, a lot of evidence, and a lot of information that convicts the President of the United States of serious wrongdoing. Just imagine that that's going on. And the President, as a part of his strategy of defense, turns around and attacks Kenneth Starr, the special prosecutor, and begins to try to make him the villain. And all these attacks begin, orchestrated attacks, begin coming from all sorts of courses. Well, he's being dishonest. He's spilling the air with leaks. He's acting unethically. He's out to get the president. His motivation is part of a right-wing conspiracy and so forth. Now, I don't know about you folks, but I've been around long enough and I've been through enough tar pits and mud holes in my life that I recognize the tactic. It is an attempt to turn things upside down. One of the reasons I recognized it as quickly as I did is because I have seen it in the church, where you've got a man dead to rights. I mean, he's up against the wall. He's like a deer in the headlights, and the crosshairs are on him, and you've actually got him. The evidence is there. Everything is there. And the man turns around and attacks the people who brought the evidence against him so effectively that people begin to believe this person rather than believing the people that have got the goods. It's amazing, isn't it? But I would dare say that under certain circumstances, any one of you in this room could be had by such a person. The reason I say that is because I have seen all kinds of people who have been in the past. Been there, done that, and have quite a bit of familiarity with it. And it's really been strange to me watching L'Affaire La Monica develop with a sense of deja vu, because of what I have seen develop in the church. I was just talking to Wayne Hinton before church, and he mentioned the fact, it's in the corporate world exactly the same thing, same tactics, same methods. Well, of course, there's a reason for this. It's tried and true. People have been doing it for 6,000 years. And because it keeps on working, and because certain types, criminal types, certain people who have no respect for the truth, who are willing to say anything to protect themselves, have used this technique of the big lie in order to get into power or to get influence over people, and have led a lot of people astray down through all kinds of history. Now, it's amazing to me to watch it all develop, but it's out there. It goes on all the time. Now, I'm going to take you back a little further in Isaiah 22, in verse 22, and we'll go on into chapter 3. Cease you from man whose breath is in his nostrils, says God, for wherein is he to be accounted of? For behold, the Lord of hosts does take away from Jerusalem and from Judah the stay and the staff, the whole stay of bread, the whole stay of water. Famine. They're going to be actually locked up in the city. They're not going to have any bread to eat. They're not going to have any water to drink. I'm also going to take away the mighty man, the man of war, the judge, the prophet, the prudent, the ancient, the captain of 50, and the honorable man, and the counselor, and the cunning artificer, and the eloquent orator. I'm going to take all these people away from them. Now, this is an important scripture because it tells you what God considers to be important in the leadership of people. He considers it very important that there be mighty men, that there be men who are capable of making war, that there be honest judges, that there be prophets and prudent, that the old people, who ancient men in the civilization of society, are there to be heard and listened to because of their vast experience. And also the honorable man. The honorable man. The man who will stand before you and tell the truth. Now, honestly, I think, where things are right now, that we have a right, maybe even an obligation, because we believe the President of the United States should be an honorable man who will stand before us and tell us something, that we can absolutely depend on the fact that he will tell us the truth. I think, in a sense, the public in this country have an obligation to accept what he says is the truth. Meanwhile, I honestly believe that Ken Starr and his investigators should get in there and do their best or do their worst, depending upon your point of view, to develop the evidence which they should in turn turn over to Congress. And if it should turn out that this man whom we have been accepting is telling us the truth has lied to us, as he has, then I think Congress ought to throw the book at him. I think that they ought to impeach him. I think they ought to throw him out of office. They ought to try him and convict him and put him in a red suit and put shackles on his ankles and on his feet and take him off to prison. Because we as a people have got the right to be able to have an honorable man in the White House who, with all of his other human weaknesses, will stand before the American people, and we can depend on his word. If we can't, we don't have anything. Because a man who will lie to protect his own backside on a question of morality, like a trivial piece of fluff that he has on the side around the White House, will also lie to us about his reasons for going to war. He'll also lie to us about his reasons for sending your sons and your daughters out to fly airplanes to bomb Saddam Hussein. He'll lie to us about the reason why he wants to keep troops in Bosnia longer than he otherwise might be doing so. If he'll lie to us about the one thing, how can we be sure he will not lie to us about anything? Trust is so important. Honor is so important. And honor means you don't lie. You know, this is one of the most fundamental principles that men who go into the officer corps of the Air Force, the Navy, and the Army are taught in the academies. Duty, honor, and country. And what honor means is when you're called in before your commanding officer for some malfeasance or some misuse of whatever it is that you've done, and he calls you on the carpet, and as an officer and a gentleman he says, "Did you do this?" You tell the truth. You don't lie. You don't shade it. You don't pretend anything else. You may get yourself roasted. You may be in a lot of trouble. You may get a bad efficiency report, but you don't lie. For if our officers cannot depend upon one another to tell the truth, that bond of confidence that makes up the brotherhood of arms will go in the tank. And as a people, when we lose that, we aren't even going to be able to defend ourselves effectively anymore. Honesty and truth. Now, I'll be the first one to admit that in wartime, there are reasons for deception. That's to deceive the enemy. And if it's necessary sometimes to leave the American people in the dark or deceive them a bit in order to deceive the enemy a bit, then that's okay. but you don't deceive them to protect yourself. And you don't deceive them in peacetime. The President of the United States has got to be a more honorable man than that. And so does the President of a church. So does the pastor of a church. So does the leader of God's people. Must be an honorable man. Any man who would say, before Christ in God, I lie not, and then lie. This is really bad, right? What kind of a person do we have when a person will say before God, in Christ, I lie not, and then lie to us? What have we got? I think it's important for us to face these questions and understand them. God says, I'm going to take all these away, and I'll give children to be your princes, and babes shall rule over you, and the people will be oppressed, every one by another and every one by his neighbor. The child shall behave himself proudly against the ancient, he'll spit on the old man, and the base against the honorable. Well, and why not? For base behavior is no big deal. It's not any worse than honorable behavior. So why should the base not behave themselves proudly against the honorable? It will happen, folks, in a country where we no longer value honor. And I have to tell you, we're there. This is not guesswork. We're there. You can see it in the polls that are coming down all the time. You can see it with these thick microphones in front of people's faces. And they basically will tell you, well, I know he probably told a little lie on this thing, but I think he's done a good job for the economy. We're all at work, and we've all got jobs. We've got plenty of money. I tell you, I did appreciate one thing Trent Lott said when they asked him this question. Do you think the reason his poll numbers are so high is just because everybody's got jobs and the economy's good and we've all got money? And Trent Lott said, I hope not. He said, if it is, I've got to rethink my whole idea of public life and public service and government. And I thought, yeah, I think it should be. It's uncanny how this is happening in civil government at the same time it's happening in the church. It's almost as though a spirit blew through and exposed corruption wherever it found it in that place. But there's a little more to it than that. And that's one thing I want to try to help you to understand something today that I'm pretty sure that you don't. In John verse 5, there is this curious little incident that people often ask about. John chapter 5 and verse 2. There is at Jerusalem, by the sheep market, a pool which is called in the Hebrew tongue Bethesda, having 5 porches. In these lay a great multitude of impotent folk, the blind, halt, withered, waiting for the moving of the water. For an angel went down at a certain season into the pool and troubled the water. Whoever then first went in after the troubling of the water and stepped in was made whole of whatever disease he had. Now, the rest of the story is of interest, but that's all that I'm after today, is to establish that one point. Now, this is really a very strange passage, and it reveals something about God that really runs counter to what we tend to think. Wouldn't you normally think that God would give His gifts to the worthy? That God would give His gifts to good people? That God would give His gifts to people who ought to have them or who deserve them? But the truth is, there's a pool there, and there are all kinds of maimed and impotent people and what have you around here, and an angel goes down and disturbs the water, stirs the water. And all of a sudden, you have all these people trying to rush and work hard and get to the water, struggling and pulling themselves over by their hands, that the first one who got a hand in the pool was healed of whatever it was he had wrong with him. That's bizarre in a way. Why did God do that? You see, the healing was random. And whoever got there and received the gift of healing on that occasion, and healing is a gift, it happened to him because he was faster than someone else. Because he could move better than a guy who was crippled. Indeed, the poor guy that Jesus said, well, you're waiting for the moving of the waters, he said, well, yes, but he says, I don't have anybody to carry me over there, and every time it's happened, I get near there, but somebody beats me in because quality, in a way, to it. But when you understand this, that God sometimes gives men gifts in a random pattern, you're going to understand something about God that, as I said, you may not fully understand, and you really need to. I don't know if you've seen the movie Amadeus or not. It's a movie about the life of Mozart, and it's a fascinating parable. There's a little scene in the movie where Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart says to the king, almost with tears in his eyes, he said, I know that I am a crude and vulgar man, but my music is not. The recognition that Mozart himself did not deserve what he had. Now, great musicians like Mozart who are gifted have a certain genius. It is really, it transcends anything that you would normally expect in human development or human ability. I think Mozart was able to pick up a violin and play it almost the first time he picked it up when he was just a little child. His music and his compositions were starting to be made when he was just a little child. He has this incredible volume of works that he has produced, and he died, what, in his 30s? He's a very young man. He came up like a candle and burned out. His story is a heartbreaking story. If you've never seen the movie, I think you might find it fascinating to go and see it. And the story in the movie is the contrast between Mozart and a missionary Salieri, is that his name? Salieri, who was also a very good musician, a very competent musician, but he just didn't have the gift. And he went through this terrible agony in his life, almost to insanity, because of his resentment of God for having given that gift to Mozart, who didn't deserve it, and not having given it to him, who did. Now, there are theories that you'll find among some religious people who have a hard time dealing with this concept. That, well, this genius, it is supernatural, but it must be demonic, because God would never do that. Well, I've got news for you folks. God gives gifts to men in random fashion. Oh yeah, there are people to whom he gives gifts for reasons, for his plan, because they're called, because they're chosen. He gave special gifts to Paul because Paul was called and Paul was chosen deliberately. But apart from all of that, God gives gifts to men in random fashion. Why? Why would he do that? Well, it could be because he likes music. So let's give to this fellow here this incredible, staggering gift of music, composition, and performance, and let's enjoy him. And I think that's something we may also not think about. And I recall the line in the movie Chariots of Fire, which I always thought about, this Scottish missionary, student who was going to be a missionary, who could run the 100-yard dash and so fast. And he makes this statement to, I think it was his girlfriend. He said, God made me fast, and I run for his pleasure. And I just thought, my, what an attitude from the man, and what a concept. I can actually run for God's pleasure. You mean God would watch a track meet? Why not? We think they're interesting. We think it's fascinating. We think it's interesting to find people who will actually work hard, who will deny themselves, who will strive for the mastery, as Paul said, who will drive themselves on and give up all kinds of things in order to make this race run a little faster than anyone else has ever run it. It's inspiring, frankly, to see people like that perform. It's inspiring to me to go to a concert and listen to a man play the piano who is obviously highly talented and who has worked all his life to reach this level of proficiency. I go out of there inspired to want to do my best with those gifts that God has given me. And God gives gifts to men in that way. I believe that one of the gifts that God gives to men is a special kind of leadership. We tend to call it charisma. And these men who have this gift, have a very real power. And they actually radiate it. I remember once walking up to, perhaps as closest from here to the front row, to Billy Graham after he had delivered a speech at an evangelistic conference in Fort Worth. And it was incredible. The man had, at that time, and I'm sure he still does, a charisma in person that you will never experience, feel, or be aware of through television or radio. You will know, watching him on television or listening to a tape of his or listening to him on radio, you will know the man is a very effective public speaker. You'll know he's a strong evangelist. But unless you experience the man in person, you have not experienced Billy Graham. Had an incredible charisma. That close to him. Never shook hands with him or anything. And I was actually taken aback by the presence of the man. That's one of the things they call it. The man has incredible presence. Now, I have experienced this in other degrees with other people. With a radio station buyer executive in Canada that I met once on a visit up there, who was one of the most charismatic men I have ever met. And the way he handled the people who were around him, the way he interacted with the people, the man was a natural-born leader of people, as we would probably tend to think of it. They are incredible. We once had a management consultant in Pasadena with all of the executives that were out there because we were struggling in some ways with administration. And so Al Portun brought the gentleman in, and he did a long series of workshops with us. And when he was finished, he said, I've done this a lot of times in my career, but I have never in my life come into contact with such a group of charismatic individuals, to use his term. They were all of us were, as he in his eyes, a group of very charismatic individuals. Well, I believe that this gift is given specifically to some men by the laying on of hands. But I also believe that it's given randomly in the world as well. Some of these men use gifts to persuade men in the ways of peace, like, to marshal great armies together, to defeat great enemies and evil men. One of the classic examples of that is Winston Churchill, who was such a man. That gift was given to him, and it was given to him in a timely fashion because he was a man who was in the position to defeat another man with a similar gift, whose name was Adolf Hitler, who was one of the most charismatic men to ever walk on the face of the planet. A powerful man. Some men use them for good. Some men use them for seduction, and there are more kinds of seduction than sexual. They use their great power to seduce young girls, or they use their great power to amass huge fortunes. They use their great power to steal money from the weak, and all manner of use of people for themselves. There are people of all kinds. The power comes into the world, and those who receive it make choices as to how they are going to use it. There may be a person to whom the gift of music has been given who makes incredibly beautiful music. It may be given to another man who uses it to hurt, to destroy, and to corrupt. The great men of generations past are men who had this gift and used it for the greater good instead of using it for their own self, their own lust. And the great failures are men who have had these gifts, and the gifts have been recognized, but they use the gifts to feed their own appetites. God actually rains these gifts on us down here for our good. It doesn't fall on everyone. It only falls on a select few who have the genius. And it is given to man to be used for the good of man. Amadeus, I've said, is a metaphor for this. But if the few to whom the gift is used use it for evil, then our end is at hand. For example, Hitler, as I said, was such a man. So was Winston Churchill, such a man. So was Franklin Roosevelt, such a man. What if the balance had been different? What if, instead of Franklin Roosevelt, we had had Joe Kennedy as our president? What if, before Winston, Britain had Neville Chamberlain for their prime minister? What if there had been no Winston Churchill and Neville Chamberlain had to go on? All you've got to do is merely take away the strength of two of these men, and the third man would have triumphed. It really took two to defeat the enormous power that Hitler had concentrated in his hands. The world today, it would be a very, very different place today if that balance of gifts of God the choices had been made in different ways. So my question to you is, should we care about the character of the most powerful man in the world? Now, to me, I think there is no question. I hope there is no question to you. And one of the reasons I'm talking to you today is because I don't want you to have that question. I don't want you to get sucked in by the media. I don't want you to get sucked in by the spirit of the age and the society in which we live, to where you conclude that the character of a man who has the power between now and tonight's sundown to destroy hundreds of millions of lives by a decision that he could make. If he doesn't do it between now and sundown, he can set wheels in motion that over the next several months in Saudi Arabia, in Iraq, in Bosnia, and elsewhere could lead to the loss not only of the lives of hundreds of people there, but also will lead to the loss of the lives of a lot of our sons and daughters. I think the character of our leaders is important in the nation and in the church. If we get to the place where all we're concerned about is results, we're in a lot of trouble, and we can be had. There's an interesting illustration in biblical history of a man like this, a man upon whom this great gift fell. It was a staggering gift. I don't know if you really have perhaps fully appreciated just how charismatic this man was. And he was, in his day, the most powerful man in the world. His name was David, the son of Jesse. You ought to read his story again, the whole thing, all the way from about 1 Samuel 15 before that, even the beginning with Saul, and read all the way through the story of David, because it is a really remarkable story of a very remarkable man. Saul, before David, had the same gift. He had the same charisma. He was a remarkable man himself. He stood head and shoulders above the people. He was a warrior of the first water. He was a strong man, a big man. He could carry the sword in his hand, like you and I would carry a kitchen knife. He was quite a man in his time. And the people admired him. He was quite a fellow, Saul was. Before, he had that charisma, but Saul abused it. And this is the part of the story. The Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul after that abuse, and Saul turned into a man who, he was really a mental wreck. The question is whether he was even sane or not. But I want to start with you in 1 Samuel, the 16th chapter, and I want to point out a few things about this charismatic man that God poured out this gift upon, and in turn then chose for a task that he had in mind. So you can maybe understand a little bit better what I'm talking about. It came to pass in 1 Samuel 16, verse 6, that when they were come, he looked on Eliab. Now, what's happened here is that Samuel has been sent to anoint a replacement for Saul, the king. He's gone to Jesse, and he's supposed to look at Jesse's sons. Well, they then line up Jesse's sons to come by for Samuel to look at them. It came to pass that when these sons were come, that Samuel looked on Eliab, and he said, "Boy, he has got it. This is the Lord's anointed that's standing in front of him." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Don't look on his countenance, don't look on his height. I have refused him. For the Lord sees not as man sees, for man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." You might want to mark that for those times when you're talking with someone and you want to make the point that God looks on the heart. He doesn't look on the outward appearance like man does. That's where it comes from. Then Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel. And he said, "Nope, God has not chosen this." And he went all the way through the boys, and God had not chosen any of them. And Samuel said, "Well, are this all your boys? This is all your kids?" And he said, "Well, there's the youngest, and he's a sheep herder over here." And Samuel said, "Send and fetch him. We will not sit down until he has come over here." And he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy and withal of a beautiful countenance, and good to look to. And the Lord said, "Arise, anoint him. He's the one." Now David's beauty, his physical appearance, and being goodly to look at, his complexion and all, was a part of the package. It was a part of what made David appealing to so many people. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brethren, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel went up and went to Ramah. But the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord troubled him. Now I want you to think about this for a moment. Because our tendency is to think only in terms of the Holy Spirit, having originally come upon Saul, and he was able to prophesy and all these things, and then the Holy Spirit left him in this way. But the truth is that Saul was a charismatic person. He was one of these people upon whom God's gift, the power of influencing people, had descended. And when the Spirit of God left him, the Holy Spirit left him, he was still a charismatic man, a powerful man, the most powerful man in Israel at the time. And it had a power that had been growing, as a matter of fact, as God had used him to deliver Israel out of the hands of their enemies. He was still a very powerful man. Now let's turn back a couple of pages to 1 Samuel 18 and verse 1. David has gone out and defeated Goliath, and with all the success that comes with that, all the glory that comes with that, he suddenly has not only established himself not only as a good-looking young man, a very pleasing young man, a very goodly looking and goodly up to approach young man. He's now turned himself into a hero. Why? Because he had faith, he had confidence. This man had so much confidence that it oozed out of his pores. He walks up and says, "What's the war you're worried about? Why is no one fighting him? I'll go fight him." And that confidence carried him right out there, and the blessing of God that was upon him, he won the fight. So all of a sudden, not only did David have the personal charisma or power of his personality, now he has the charisma that goes with being a man of war, of being a successful fighter who has delivered his people and in great reputation. Well, it came to pass in chapter 18, verse 1, that when he made an end of speaking to Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him like his own soul. You need to understand something, folks. Men who have this gift attract people in the way that David attracted Jonathan. I mean, they gather them like honey will gather flies. They are good to be with. People enjoy them. They are charismatic. There's something about a man who has this gift that people want to please him. They want to give to him. They want to be around him. Whatever his wish is turns out to be their command. It is a strange gift, and it's an incredible power, and there are a lot of people, not a lot, but there are some people in this world who have that gift. David had it. Now, I don't know if you understand how great it was. I'm going to try to help you understand that before I'm finished. They know what Jonathan, Saul took him that day and would no longer let him go any more to his father's house. Then David and Jonathan made a covenant because he loved him like his own soul. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was upon him, which was a symbol of the prince. It was kingly authority. And he put it on David. He gave him his garments. He gave him his sword. He gave him his bow. He gave him his girdle. Clothes in this time, folks, were a symbol of power. Jonathan is pleased to turn over every bit of his power to David, increasing the man's power even more. And David went out wherever Saul sent him and behaved himself wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people and the sight of Saul's servants. Everybody thought he was terrific. Everybody thought he couldn't put a foot wrong. People believed him and trusted him. It came to pass that as they came, when David was returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, that the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing, to meet King Saul with tabrets and joy and with instruments of music. And the women sang back and forth to one another as they played and said, Saul has slain his thousands, and David has slain his 10,000. And the spirit of jealousy descended upon Saul. He was furious. And they have ascribed to David 10,000, and to me they have ascribed but thousands. What else can he have but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day forward. And, as we all know, tried to kill him shortly thereafter. Now, there's a lot that can be said about David's life. And I could go to example after example, but I don't want to do that today. I think you can benefit from that just as much by going home, putting your feet up on a stool somewhere with a cup of coffee, and read through the life of David with what I'm telling you in mind, of looking at the man's personal power, his personal character, and the weaknesses that occasionally cropped up in his personal character, and realizing that this man had an incredible... He was one of those people upon whom that charisma had fallen before the Spirit of God even came upon him. And after the Spirit of God and the events of his life, David was a man of incredible power. He scared Saul to death because Saul could see in him the end of his own kingdom, and to some extent maybe even the end of his own life. I'm going to take you now, though, to 2 Samuel, to the end of David's life, because I want you to understand, again, my objective is not merely to talk about David, but for you to understand this principle that I'm talking about just how powerful some people can become in this world. In 2 Samuel chapter 23, these are the last words of David. David, the son of Jesse, said, and the man who was raised up on high, the anointed of the God of Jacob, and the sweet psalmist of Israel, said, the last words of David, the Spirit of the Lord spoke by me. His word was in my tongue. The God of Israel said, the rock of Israel spoke to me. He that ruleth over men must be just, ruling in the fear of the Lord. He that rules over men must be just and must rule in the fear of the Lord. And that's what we want. We want a man as our president, as our ruler, as whoever is in charge of us, to be in the nation or in the church, to be just, to be honest, to be a person who has the fear of God upon him, a person who would be scared to death to say, behold, before God in Christ, I lie not, and then lie. A man who would be scared to write a letter that was dishonest or untrue in any way and sign that letter in Jesus' name. This man, if you have a king who is honorable, a ruler who is honest and who is just, he shall be as the light in the morning when the sun rises, and a morning without clouds, like the tender grass springing out of the dry earth by clear shining after rain. Although my house is not so with God. David realized that he had not measured up to the standard that he was describing here when David came up with his last words. David is an honest man. David told the truth. And so consequently it was not in him, as he came to the end of his life, to claim the kind of ruler, to be the kind of ruler that here he was describing that God really expected rulers to be. He said, "My house is not that way, although God has made with me an everlasting covenant, ordered in all things and sure, for this is my salvation and all my desire, although he make it not to grow. But the sons of Belial shall be as thorns thrust away, because they cannot be taken with the hands. The man that shall touch them must be fenced with iron." This is a very obscure translation in verse 7, and is not entirely relevant to what I'm trying to say. In verse 8, these are the names of the mighty men whom David had. Now, a lot of times, you can tell a lot about a man by the men he gathers around him. What kind of a man was David? Take a look at the men who were loyal to him. These are the names of the mighty men whom David had. The Tachmonite that sat in the seat, chief among the captains, his name was Adino the Eznite. He lifted up his spear against 800 whom he slew in one battle. These men now, this is the first of them. He's the leader of all David's men of arms. These are men who wore their clothes out from the inside. These are tough, really tough men. They are hard men, battle-hardened men, strong men, men of character, men who would have died before they would have lied to David about anything. He had managed himself to achieve, to deserve, to earn the loyalty of these men. After him was Eleazar, the son of Dodo the Ahohite. And of the three mighty men of David, when they defied the Philistines that were there gathered together to battle, the men of Israel were gone away. He arose and smote the Philistines until his hand was weary and his hand clave to the sword. In other words, when the battle was over, they had to pry his fingers off the hilt of the sword. It was locked in place. And the Lord wrought a great victory that day, and the people returned after him only to spoil. And after him was Shammah, the son of Agi the Heraite. The Philistines were gathered together into a troop, and there was a piece of ground full of lentils. And everybody fled from the Philistines. They were going to take that crop. But not this man. This man stood in the middle of the ground and defended it and slew the Philistines, and the Lord wrought a great army that day. These are the kind of men. Everybody else runs. They don't run. They take the sword in their hand. They hold it so tight that they have to pry their fingers off at the end of the day, and they can fight an army 10 times their own size. 10 men is nothing. 30 men is nothing. 100 men is nothing. Send them on because God is with me. This is the kind of men he actually attracted. 3 of the 30 chief men went down and came to David in harvest time at the cave of Adullam. And the troop of the Philistines was pitched in the valley of Rephaim. And I love this story. This tells us an enormous amount about the kind of men we're talking about here. David was then in a hold, and the garrison of the Philistines was in Bethlehem. And David, sitting around a campfire one night, as you will do, you kind of wish for this. Boy, I'd sure like to be here, sure like to do that, and all this kind of thing. And he makes a kind of a careless statement. He says, "Boy, I wish someone would give me a drink of the water of the well of Bethlehem by the gate." And the problem is, when you're a man like David, with the kind of charisma, who is so attractive, whom men want to please, whom men love like their own life, and who would lay down their life for him, when they heard him say that, 3 of them, the 3 mighty men, the 3 toughest of his group, broke through the host of the Philistines, drew water out of the well of Bethlehem by the gate, and brought it to David. Now, that's the kind of man you want to have with you, isn't it? The kind of people, if you say, "Boy, I'd sure like to have a drink of that water," bang, they're down there, they get it, they're back. And they aren't scratched, they aren't hurt, but I wouldn't want to vouch for the Philistines, who there were around that hold. They gave it to David, and David wouldn't drink it. He poured it out on the ground in front of them. He said, "Be it far from me, O Lord, that I shall do this. This is the blood of the men that went in jeopardy of their lives," and he would not drink it. These things did these 3 mighty men. You see, you're talking about men of honor. You're talking about a man who, because he was the kind of man he was, these men would risk their lives to get him a drink of water out of a well he wanted to have it out of. Now, it's hard to imagine that, because you and I aren't around people like that much. But I have been around people, I have known people that I have very much wanted to please. People who, as long as I thought they were as loyal to me as I was to them, I would have done nearly anything within God's law to please them, to serve them, to get what they wanted done, to carry it out, because they had this power. They had this kind of a gift from God. David must have had incredible charisma. He abused it from time to time. He abused it when he sent for a woman who was saw bathing on a roof across the way and says, "Bring her to me." Bathsheba could have turned him down. She could have refused. But David was not only the king, he was David. And she, like everybody else around, wanted to please him. wanted to do what he wanted. Wanted to give him what he wanted, even though what he wanted was not right. He called, she came. And I can't help but think of the really apt parallel between that and President Clinton and President Kennedy, men who have charisma, who have great gifts and can call a woman, and she comes and does his bidding and gives him whatever he wants because he's the president, because he has power, but it's more than that. They have that gift. There are people like that in every age, gifted people. And the degree that we allow ourselves to slip away from the Bible and moral behavior is the degree to which you and I can be deceived and led astray by people like that. They can actually take you places that you should never go. They can cause you to do things that you should never do. And somewhere down inside of yourself there has got to be a hard moral core that will not allow you to do this to please this man. That will not allow you to do wrong because someone that you respect and love has asked you to do it. Somewhere there has got to be that hard moral core. Saul is the archetype of a man who was gifted by God, who turned away from God. And he serves as a perpetual reminder that just because God is with a man today says absolutely nothing about tomorrow. And just because a man is gifted by God does not mean that he is always going to use those gifts the way that he should use them. Sometimes they use them for our good, and sometimes they use them for seduction. It's also why another man named Saul of Tarsus, whom we call Paul, said that he also could be a castaway. That he watched himself, and he said, "Follow me as I follow Christ." I am astonished, actually, at how people will follow a leader wherever he takes them without any consideration of his morals. I have to think this is a matter of charisma. He is special. We'll follow him. We'll follow him wherever he goes, even to hell. Now I want you to turn back in conclusion over to 2 Timothy. 2 Timothy chapter 2. I begin reading in verse 15. "Study to show yourself approved unto God, a workman that needs not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth." You actually, I don't think we realize that we are in a war, that these are dangerous times, and that we're going to have to see to ourselves and look to ourselves, and that there are things that we really need to do to be sure that we don't go following some charismatic leader to hell. He says, you need to be not ashamed, but rightly dividing the word of truth. But shun profane and vain babblings. They will increase unto more ungodliness. Their word will eat like a cancer. And he named two people, Hymenaeus and Philetus, who concerning the truth have erred, saying the resurrection is past already, and have overthrown the faith of some people. Now, how in the world can you imagine that people will sometimes be led astray by some of the most stupid doctrines you could ever imagine? How does it happen? Do you know? It happens because they believe somebody they ought not to believe. Because they follow somebody they ought not to follow. It happens because of the abuse of the charisma that God oftentimes gives to men. Nevertheless, the foundation of God stands sure, having this seal: the Lord knows them that are His. And let everyone that names the name of Christ depart from iniquity. What's iniquity? It's lawlessness. Lawless behavior. And just riding over the law of God. We need to come to understand something, that just because a man has been anointed of God does not mean he is right in everything he is doing. And that the mission that God gives to a man is not sufficient to override immoral, dishonest behavior. You can't do it, folks. I'm sorry. We need to understand that. And one of the things that we need to be committed to as much as anything in the world is the truth. Sure, forgive sin. Sure, forgive sinners. Sure, give them a break. But expose the sin. Get it out in the light of day. Be sure people know about it. Because if they don't know about it, they're very liable to be led astray by a person whom God has by now rejected. In every great house there are vessels of gold and silver, but also of wood and earth, and some to honor, and some to dishonor. If a man purge himself from these, he shall be a vessel unto honor, sanctified and fit for the master's use, and prepared to every good work. But there are some people who get the gift, and they wind up being a vessel for dishonor. Flee also youthful lust, but follow righteousness, faith, charity, peace, with them that call on the Lord out of a pure heart. foolish, and unlearned questions avoid. All they do is gender arguments. And the servant of the Lord must not strive. We're not supposed to be in arguments like that, but to be gentle to all men, have to teach patience, in meekness, instructing those who oppose themselves, if peradventure God will give them repentance to the acknowledging of the truth. You know something? We have made a serious mistake in our lives when we have referred to our doctrines and a set of doctrines as the truth, to where people can actually say they are dedicated to the truth because they are dedicated to the argument that the seventh day is the Sabbath. They are dedicated to the argument that the holy day should be observed by Christians in the modern world. A dedication to truth means you don't lie. A dedication to truth means if someone you know lies, you don't call him a liar necessarily, but you let the lie be known. And you tell the truth. That they may recover themselves out of the snare of the devil, who are taken captive of him at his will. And I tell you, I don't know of any way of defending yourself effectively against the devil unless you're prepared to deal with the truth from the inside out, in everything, in every aspect of what you do. And this know also, that in the last days perilous times shall come. For men will be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, incontinent, fierce, despisers of good people, traitors, heady, high-minded, lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God, having a form of godliness and denying the authority of it. You realize what you just read? The description sounds like somebody you'd meet down on Skid Row. It sounds like some guy you'd meet in a gambling casino out in Las Vegas. No. These people have a form of godliness. They can be religious leaders and lead people in this direction. In the last days, perilous times will come. You know, when I think about this, I hearken back to what Jesus said in the Olivet prophecy, when he said, as we get down to the time of the end, it's going to be very, very dangerous for people. And he said, because iniquity shall abound, the love of many will wax cold. And the truth is that for, I think, most of us, you live in the world, you're a part of the world, you can't get away from it, and in any way keep in touch with what's going on around you. But there is a slow, steady drip, drip, drip on you, having to do with your morals, with your character, your devotion to God, your devotion to truth, that unless you fight for your own life, it will eventually wear you away. The Scriptures tell us that the dripping of water will wear away a stone. And the constant drip, drip, drip of lies, dishonesty, messing around with the truth can get us to the place to where someone will ask us, do you believe the President of the United States lied to you? You say, yeah. Do you approve of the job that he's doing? Or you approve of him as your president? And you will say yes. Never knowing that what you have just said is a complete contradiction in terms. You are in a war. The war is designed to put calluses on your feelings, to put calluses on your sensitivity, to get you to the place to where you are tolerant of sin, you are tolerant of lies, you are tolerant of deceit, you are tolerant of abominable behavior in government and even in leaders in the church. The question is really now entirely yours, because there is no disciplinary force, nobody's going to do this for you. You're going to have to find your own moral fiber, your own moral high ground, your own place where you're going to stand and say, I'm not going to be moved from this point because this is right. And that you will not come to the place to where you're willing to accept corrupt behavior in a person just because he's charismatic.